Christmas shopping. In many countries, Christmas is, above all, a time for giving presents, either out of affection or from a sense of obligation. Recently, though, a new trend in the observance of this custom has come into fashion in the United States. Nowadays, many young people do not confine themselves to giving presents to other people. They also give them to themselves. In fact, according to a recent survey, over 70% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 buy themselves Christmas presents. Many older people, however, disapprove of such behavior, regarding it as a breach of the Christmas spirit. Even when they do not see it as morally wrong, older people feel too inhibited to spend money on presents for themselves. Youngsters, however, feel no objection to doing so. One reason is simple. As they do not yet have children themselves, they can afford this extra expenditure. Another reason, though, is generational. This generation grew up amid numerous consumer goods at a time when the economy was flourishing. Accustomed to receiving presents frequently from their parents, they continue to crave new possessions after they have grown up. Moreover, when they spend money on others, they feel they deserve some compensation themselves. To sum up, this new custom is not so much the sign of a moral flaw in younger people as a testimony to the fact that they grew up at a time when both money and new consumer goods abounded.
服役中の囚人が働くレストランがウェールズに誕生しました。
Prisoner restaurants. Recently, a new luxury restaurant opened in Cardiff in Britain. But there is something different about this restaurant. Its staff is almost entirely composed of personnel chosen from among prisoners in a nearby jail. A further 15 prisoners work on a prison farm, growing food for the restaurant. The motive for establishing the restaurant was to provide vocational training for the prisoners to help them integrate into society when they are released. Most prisoners leave prison unfit for work and so quickly fall back into a life of crime. By giving the trainees the chance to earn qualifications, the prison service plans to turn them into skilled workers, able to make it by themselves when they subsequently return to society. The work also gives the prisoners themselves a sense of accomplishment. Not everybody agrees with the restaurant, though. Right to Work, a group that campaigns on behalf of jobless young people in the UK, has strongly criticised the use of prisoners as cheap labour. They argue that in a time of recession, when many people are being made redundant and unemployment is high, it is ridiculous to replace ordinary workers with prisoners. Moreover, the wages paid to the prisoners are so low that the group fears that other businesses will begin to follow suit and outsource work to prisons. The result would be that even more young people would find themselves out of work.
ローンの返済に苦しむアメリカ人がたくさんいます。なぜ
Give now, pay later. In general, U.S. citizens not only tend to incur much more personal debt than people in other countries do, but also they owe much more money than they did in the past. Many people today not only have to pay off the installments on their housing and car loans every month, but also very high interest rates charged by credit card companies. Some people blame this state of affairs on the greed and the materialistic values of modern America, and contrast this with the past, when people had more foresight and were more financially prudent. According to Charles Geist, a professor of finance, though, such a view is very misleading. In fact, Americans have always been a highly speculative people. The difference was that in the past, they had much less opportunity to borrow money. For one thing, banks very rarely lent money to individuals. Moreover, most states had usury laws, which forbade financial companies from charging high interest rates. These safeguards, though, came to be abandoned. With loans easily available, many people were carried away and borrowed against future income, counting on later rises in salary to cover their debts. As a result, they became hostages to the banks and credit card companies, trapped in debts they could never pay off. According to Geist, it is hypocritical to blame the resulting hardships only on individuals. Society itself needs to restrict the behavior of financial institutions before the personal debt problem worsens any further.
ロシアが IT 分野の発展に力を注ぎ始めました。狙いは真の
A new science city. Russia has a long and proud scientific tradition, but this tradition has not always added up to economic success. Under the centralized socialist system of the former USSR, when most of the economy was in state ownership, scientific research was often carried out in science cities. These were usually closed cities where scientists and technicians lived behind barricades guarded by soldiers. Strict censorship was enforced, allowing the government to cover up even the existence of these cities. Officially, this was to prevent spying, but the scientists were also segregated from ordinary Soviet citizens. This was because they were allocated generous state funding and given access to foreign luxuries that most people never saw. After the collapse of the USSR and Russia's adoption of a capitalist system, most of the closed cities were abolished, and the policy of building science cities was discontinued. However, the new Russia has not always been successful at cashing in on its scientific strengths. Although many state enterprises have been privatized, the bureaucracy has not always had a good relationship with entrepreneurs who complain of petty regulations and arbitrary tax policies. One result has been that Russia remains economically dependent on its enormous natural resources such as oil and gas, and that it has suffered the humiliation of falling far behind its Western competitors in the field of information technology. Now, the Russian government has come up with an ambitious new strategy designed to improve its standing in information technology. The aim is to reproduce the success of California's famous Silicon Valley on Russian soil. The government's plan is to create its first new science city since the fall of the USSR, one specializing in advanced technology. This time, the city will not be hidden away in Siberia, but will be situated outside a village near Moscow. Moreover, most of the research will be done by private companies, although these will also be the recipients of generous subsidies. The companies will also be exempt from taxation for the time being and free from the many bureaucratic constraints that usually make life for businesses so difficult in Russia. Some scientists and businessmen in Russia have applauded the new initiative. Others, however, are more doubtful. They point out that the plan is an administrative decision made by a government bureau known as the Commission on Modernization. Although the inspiration for the plan is Silicon Valley, they argue it is unlikely that a scheme run by a government will really be able to create an equivalent to the Californian original. Although the plan welcomes foreign investment, the bureaucracy will still have indirect control over what happens in the city. The Russian government, though, hopes its plan will allow the country to truly modernize its economy.
アメリカの政治の特徴といえば、大きな政府を目指す民主党と小さな政府
Changing places. One of the most conspicuous differences between the Democratic and Republican parties in the United States is the attitude they take to the power of the federal government, and in particular to the question of federal spending. In every election, Democratic candidates are usually united in their condemnation of the growing inequality in American society. They tend to argue in favor of compassionate welfare policies designed to help those who find it difficult to succeed in a competitive capitalist economy. Republicans, on the other hand, rarely pass up an opportunity to express their hostility to any interference with the workings of the free market. They also frequently criticize people who, as they see it, live off the hard work of taxpayers. This distinction between the two parties can be traced back to the election of 1936, where they collided over the policies known as the New Deal. President Franklin Roosevelt proposed a series of reforms aimed to help the country recover from the Great Depression. The Republican candidate, Alf Landon, however, opposed these measures as a reckless drain on government resources and a recipe for economic disaster. Roosevelt, of course, went on to win by a landslide. The Republicans, though, continued to criticize Democratic policies as wasteful and inefficient, and to insist on the need for the incentives of the free market as a spur to economic growth. Back in the 1860s, though, voters would have been astonished to hear such views expressed by Republican candidates. At that time, the Republican Party eagerly embraced a policy of massive federal spending, which was used to help build the Transcontinental Railroad, to establish state universities, and to settle the West. They also stressed a need for fairness and passed laws, for example, that protected African Americans from discrimination. At this time, the Democrats dominated the South, and they opposed all these measures. On the other hand, the Republicans were happy for the federal government to foot the bill for the expensive policies. So what caused the two parties to modify their perspectives so dramatically? According to historian Eric Rauchway of the University of California at Davis, the transformation was first heralded by a shift in democratic policies around the start of the 20th century. After the Civil War, all politicians wished to win the support of poor settlers in the West, and both parties supported government spending. The Republicans, however, mainly represented big business interests who had benefited from the boom caused by building the railroads. Once this infrastructure was established, these businesses wanted to curb both taxation and public spending. As a result, the two parties diverged, and the Republicans became aggressive critics of federal spending who urged the need to cut back on federal programs.
移民は多くの先進国で問題になっていますが、実は移民が
The effects of immigrant workers. In all advanced countries, as labor costs have risen, the number of workers who have immigrated into these countries in search of a better livelihood has dramatically increased. This has made immigration a touchy political issue in many societies. On the one hand, businesses welcome the cheap labor. On the other hand, many ordinary people reckon that immigrants are to blame for falling wages, and also that they inflict unemployment on domestic workers. This leads to the idea that immigration has got out of control. Some politicians play up this idea, provoking governments to impose stricter controls on immigration. But is it true? Economists who have studied the issue warn against such a hasty conclusion. In fact, there is no evidence that immigrant workers depress wages or cause domestic workers to be laid off. Indeed, in many cases, they actually cause wages to rise. One reason is that immigrant workers, just because they usually accept lower wages, have a good effect on the economy as a whole. Cheaper wages make companies more productive, which leads to lower prices and greater profits. When these profits are invested, the result is economic expansion and greater prosperity. This, in turn, causes average earnings to rise. Nevertheless, many people continue to denounce immigration. Qualified people may benefit from cheaper labor, they say, but what about the unqualified workers who usually compete with immigrants for jobs? Surely they are displaced by cheaper workers and become unemployed.